Okay, welcome back to the Natural Awakening podcast. Today I'm here with my friend and somewhat colleague, affiliate, Asher. Soryl is the last name. I know you by some aliases. Am I pronouncing the last name there correctly?
Yeah, Soryl. It's a combination of my mother's first names, actually. So, first of my name.
Asher, first of his name.
Yeah.
And we're here today to discuss, well, a whole range of topics. Asher is a PhD candidate at the University of Otago in bioethics, is very interested in issues of consciousness, valence, suffering-focused ethics, and related fields. And I thought it'd be great to just have him on and talk about that. Asher, for those who maybe you could nuance what I just said, a brief bio, maybe something about your background, how you got interested in these topics, where you're coming from, a little bit on that.
Yeah, totally. So I was raised vegan, and my mother's that I mentioned before were both like really into animal activism, like throughout my entire childhood, and so I've kind of been really focused on, I guess, like the problem of suffering broadly conceived since I can remember. And then, yeah, as a teenager, I kind of became obsessed with philosophy and realized, oh, this is all I want to do. So I went into like 2 philosophy degrees, and now I'm near the end of my third, broadly focused on animal ethics and then animal welfare, and then kind of like animal sentience. And now I'm kind of focusing really at the implementation level, or at the root of what I consider to be value. Which is consciousness, and trying to understand what is consciousness and what is valence. So that's kind of how it all ties together. But yeah, I was raised in New Zealand, and spend a lot of time in Europe. So
fantastic. And you're now in Spain, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, I've been in Barcelona for the last, I think, 4 months, and I'm here for another 2 months, kind of working on a startup. So yeah, while also working on my PhD.
Busy man.
Yeah.
All right, so to just get the kind of gotcha question out of the way, I mean, it's not so often, I think, that people get to hear from or have a conversation with professional academic philosophers who this is what they do. They've they've gone in on it. So broadly, what is philosophy?
Yeah,
terrible question. I apologize.
No, it's a really good question. It's a question I would ask if I was interviewing a philosopher. I mean, I would say philosophy is like a particular approach, or like a kind of an orientation toward reality, trying to kind of theoretically conceive of a structure or like a model of reality. Less concerned with like empirical testing or the kinds of methods that you might find in the natural sciences, but certainly informed by those methods. For me, it's just philosophy for me has always been very focused on what matters, and how can I guess like optimize my actions given what most approximates intrinsic value in the world, if that makes sense. And if you want to optimize for intrinsic value, you have to have a model of reality. You have to be confident that your actions are going to have this effect, and then maybe whatever causal chains of interactions lead to increasing the thing that approximates value. Yeah, I'm not sure.
And you need a theory of value, what that is, how one achieves it, and then causal models of the world informed by, everything.
Yeah, basically. I mean, and this is just like my definition of philosophy. A lot of people get into philosophy purely because they enjoy the method, or at least like my background is in analytic philosophy, which is kind of quite like a logical or like structured approach to unpacking, or I sometimes call it conceptual landscaping, logical analysis, philosophical questions, sorting out the concepts, finding which ones like have no place, and then dissolving them. Some people just like really like it, and I really enjoy philosophy too. But for me, I think the motivation early on and still for pursuing philosophy, isn't just like enjoyment. It is actually just like I want to be as like aligned as possible with what makes the most sense theoretically.
It's philosophy on a more classical model of discovering what is of value and importance and aligning your whole life's activities with that.
Yeah, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. Although conceptual landscaping is fun,
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
and even useful.
Yeah, clarifying. A really cool kind of area of philosophy that's like I don't know, in the last decade kind of sprung up is conceptual engineering, which maybe we can talk about later. But I think it's like, there's still ways in which philosophy can, contribute or stay relevant, to modern kind of discourse.
Speaking of, there's often this opinion that there's nothing left over for philosophy. The natural sciences have a monopoly on, truth. What would you say to someone who brought that up?
Yeah, so I'm kind of like, I'm in some ways a bad philosopher to be like repping the field of philosophy, because I kind of I think most scientists are philosophically confused and could probably do with like, better internal consistency within their model of the phenomena that they're studying. But I also think that like maybe a worse problem is that most philosophers, their ontology or their model of reality is too disconnected from physics or whatever
Sure.
whatever label we use to describe what exists. And so I would say that probably, the state of modern philosophy is like extremely like expansive, and it kind of, extends its tendrils in so many different directions. And a lot of that's like really fun and exciting if the aim of philosophy is just to kind of apply the philosophical method to anything. But if the aim is to actually like model reality correctly, then I would say that most the limbs, could probably be cut. If that makes sense. It's a bit harsh.
But... I quit my philosophy degree, so
yeah.
But I went in hard for mysticism as well. A certain form of it. So I'm not one to criticize.
Yeah, I should also say maybe this is like similar to what I was just saying about people enjoying the philosophical method. But I think that like, another criterion of good philosophy is, does it make you feel good? Does it improve your life and the lives, improve the well-being of those around you? And I feel like, if not, then that's a really strong signal that it's a thread not worth pursuing. Like, I think a lot of people apply the philosophical method to any realm of discourse and then get stuck in like local minima or of models of reality that make them feel really bad and they can't get out of it. And so I would say, yeah.
Don't read Schopenhauer if you're looking for a good time. The post-structuralist pessimistic perspectives may not be conducive to your health and well-being.
Yeah, exactly. So my two primary criteria that I use in my model is like, one is just well-being. Like, is this a fun model of reality to inhabit, which is like self-evident from the inside? And then two, predictive power. Like, does my model make predictions that I can empirically test and allow me to interface with reality in ways that I couldn't otherwise do with another model?
Otherwise, you just have fun psychosis.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which, is not a bad description of a lot of philosophy, in my opinion. But
yeah, exactly, it's not that bad. Yeah.
Okay, next big difficult question. So what we're talking about consciousness here as kind of the source of all value, or what we could call a grounding of what's worth caring about, what there is to care about. So what is consciousness / sentience? I'm assuming we're using these terms roughly interchangeably. Maybe you could nuance that there if there is a nuance to be drawn out there. What is it, and why would we want to ground all value and concern in that?
Yeah, so I'm also kind of interesting as a philosopher who cares or writes about consciousness, because I'm also like, I think most philosophical discourse, at least, just general academic discourse about consciousness is like confused in the sense of like people have different preconceptions when they use these words. And moreover, I guess my entire philosophy is based on, an axiom, which is that, there is something that it's like to use Nagle's terms. And I think that like actually there is no perfect definition of consciousness. I think if you can define something perfectly, then it doesn't really exist. It's just like a facet of whatever semantic system you've internalized. So I would
say this
say,
gets into philosophy of language and theories of reference, actually, which the early classical Indian Buddhist canon has a lot to say on, which is great. If you want to ever read, I might have recommended this to you already, The Dispeller of Disputes. Nagarjuna's, which is his text that deals mostly with philosophy of language, describes basically the view you just outlined.
Yeah, I should read it. But in my academic writings, at least, I mostly focus on sentience, and I use the term sentience more because, in my mind at least, there are more public conditions that we can kind of use to to understand or to identify when our preconceptions are aligned when we use the term. So the way that I would define sentience, and bearing in mind this is not the standard definition, but it's something that it's easier for me to describe in a conversation, is I would say sentience is when there is bounded consciousness. So there's like phenomenal binding occurring. There are non-trivial boundaries between different experiences. So like if I, pinch myself on my arm, you can't directly access the sensation. You have a model of me as a conscious subject, and you can make an inference, based on whatever abstractions you're positing in your model of having a call with me or whatever. But you can't directly.
I mean, we could get into weird scenarios where there's mirror touch synesthesia, which is an odd phenomenon, but we're going to proceed.
Yeah.
We're going to say that that's not normal and not accurately representative.
Yeah. I mean, there are some like pretty good tests we could devise, and like actually, Andres from Qualia Research Institute has written a bit on this about like tests that would like prove the problem of other minds false, which is like a long-standing philosophical problem. Why can't I access your experiences, or why can't I read your thoughts, or whatever? So I think minimally there are boundaries between consciousness, or boundaries between phenomenal space, and this is how I would like technically use the term sentience. And so when I ask, is a given entity sentient, that's kind of really what I'm pointing toward. And the reason why I think this is morally relevant, in the context of why does all of this matter, is that my preferred theory of valence, but I think like many plausible theories of valence, depend upon there being like this kind of like crisp, like non-arbitrary kind of carving of consciousness into kind of like ontologically unitary entities, if that makes sense. It is kind of continuous within
my
the
mind
space.
stream is my mind stream, your mind stream is your mind stream.
Something like that. So I don't know, maybe that's like too technical a definition, but
this podcast gets into the weeds. I kind of half-heartedly attempt to to steer things back sometimes, but I'm here for the weeds.
Yeah. Well, otherwise, I'll add one more thing, which is that just like, even though, as I said, I feel like any definition of consciousness is like imperfect or can never fully capture the thing. The best descriptions that I've seen have been what I said before about like Thomas Nagel's there being something that it's like to be, roughly like mapping onto what philosophers of mind would call phenomenal consciousness. And then this is different from like access consciousness, which is like what information is being processed, or like more of like.
And there might be more in access consciousness than there is in phenomenal consciousness. That's a pretty classic distinction, right?
Yeah. So I'm really just like talking about phenomenal consciousness, the qualities of experience that are somewhat intangible, but that we can kind of like beautifully express, using words and concepts sometimes.
Right. And this is not just a functional definition. This is, we're using phenomenal descriptors.
Yeah.
Qualia, in other words. Which is a used and, much debated and hated term in some quarters.
Yeah. It's interesting thinking about like the mapping between the concepts or the symbols that we use to talk about like phenomenal properties like qualia, the relationship between these labels and then the things themselves. Because I mean, I also, again, controversially, I also think that like the truth value, or like what makes a given statement or proposition meaningful when I'm referencing my internal states has nothing to do with some sort of isomorphism between the proposition and then the structure of my experience. I actually think it has to do with like public conditions within
social coordination.
Yeah, or within the language games that I've internalized.
Yeah.
So I'm something of a Wittgensteinian about meaning. But I don't.
Well, you won't get any argument from me on that, but
yeah. But I think most people who read Wittgenstein and apply it to talking about like phenomenology and consciousness actually misinterpret it or don't understand the nuance to this. I think if you have a community of people who are using words in these ways, you can actually meaningfully, use words.
Absolutely.
Basically. So
I mean, you run into this issue all the time in and between meditation communities. I mean, this is where I'm most familiar with this problem, where within a particular lineage community and, teacher or small group of teachers, there is actually a pretty well-defined semantic space with clear experiential reference, and everyone can talk sensibly to each other about what they mean and report honestly about their phenomenology. And then those same words are used differently by different language users in different contexts across time in different texts and different, it's fucked.
I mean, and just more broadly, different languages, different cultures, like meaning like a set of words or behaviors, expressed in a context that is outside of where these behaviors would usually be expressed, it's in a sense can be considered meaningless. You have to, context matters, to put it in a sentence, essentially.
Yeah, context is king,
Yes.
and queen, and the whole court.
Yeah.
So one issue, you can kind of tie this back to what we were just talking about as much as you like, that I think we're both very much concerned with is the issue of non-human consciousness and its moral relevance to our activities, choices, etc. There are many people throughout history and even today who don't assign consciousness at all to certain animals, or all animals. Even that's not so common these days. But even if animals are granted consciousness, they're usually not given much, if any, moral consideration. They're not considered moral patients in the same sense that one would treat, say, an infant human child. So maybe you could just run through arguments, theories for, first of all, let's establish best as one can that, in fact, non-human animals like us are fully conscious, and that they are worthy of moral consideration.
Yeah, totally. So I guess like the consideration of non-humans as sentient beings is like, I mean, it's in a sense it's not super recent because you kind of had philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill and kind of other people in the history of philosophy, and not only Western philosophy but also like obviously you have a lot more experience with Buddhist philosophy,
Buddhists, Jains,
yeah.
Lots of work on this.
Yeah. So it's not like an entirely new invention, but like science and philosophy and I guess like the intelligentsia more broadly, has been like pretty historically reluctant to grant, not only granting moral status, but to even recognize that it's like that we can make inferences about the states of non-humans. Like you saw, in the 1950s in psychology, there was like this very strong like behaviorist kind of like tendency of viewing experience even within humans as like a black box that we just like
the baby cries out in pain. We can't actually infer anything about the baby's mental state.
yeah, exactly. And so I guess the state of play now, especially in like the last, I'd say like 20 to 30 years, has been like going from maybe like only like other primates and dolphins and maybe like a few other large mammals to wow, like how many invertebrates might be sentient. And you have like some great researchers like Jonathan Birch and Heather Browning and Walter Veit, who are kind of like writing books and publishing papers on these topics, and then many others from like the animal ethics canon. So it's like being kind of the edge cases of sentience are being like considered, and it's a lot more normal to ask questions that would like previously just be shut down because it's like against
what's the status of bivalves?
Bivalves, I mean, by my estimations, so I have a chapter in my thesis that's like something, I think it's like 15,000 words at the moment. It's my thesis is way too long, but I have a chapter in my thesis where I go through different taxonomic groups of animals, and from memory, because I wrote it like 3 or 4 years ago, I thought probably bivalves aren't sentient. Like I do want to draw the line somewhere, but not really draw the line. I want to say that there are certain like thresholds that you pass when you look at like basic functional capacities of different organisms, and given some assumptions about like the adaptive value of sentience and what it renders for organisms, and giving them an explicit model of their environment. I think that probably like locomotion is one of the
sure, you need a structured
yeah, and if you're, I mean,
at least a body model with some minimal proprioception and
yeah,
tactile feedback that requires a minimal kind of self and world model.
Yeah, so I would say like, I mean, cephalopods, like certainly like quite likely various different like arthropods, land-based, marine. Depends on the species, but yeah, like certainly some of them, or like more than 80% likelihood in my model. Bivalves probably less than 20%. Although you never know. The problem is because we don't know what consciousness is, because it's like completely absent in our models. We have no idea about the energy costs for whatever mechanisms might create like a unified pocket of experience. And until we like actually have the formalism and we can actually like understand it at a physical level, then all we're left with is just like kind of philosophical speculation, which is fun, but it's like there is actually an answer
Yeah.
to this, and for some reason, like very few
Sure.
people seem to be concerned with it.
Which is bizarre, given that again, if you care about anything,
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
well, maybe we should start there. Actually, what talk about consciousness as a grounding of value in general, but then as a basis for grounding any and all value. In fact,
Yeah.
or statements, or the epistemic and then normative dimensions of consciousness as a grounding.
Yeah. So kind of as I was referring to before, like consciousness is it's that kind of thing that it is the ground for like any conceivable model. Like I think that like even just like referencing I don't know, like we never come into any knowledge about the world. We can never access like really any information outside of having an experience in which we come into contact.
Are you saying that I am not having a direct perception of this?
Well, I mean, yeah, you're not having a direct perception, but my claim is basically like consciousness is difficult because it's like it is in a sense like beyond the curtain of like what we can kind of like point toward with like our with linguistic analysis or even just like kind of the how empirical science currently functions. I think it's important to take seriously.
Well, it's the field within which all of that activity takes place would be a phenomenological lens to take on it. This coming from like Soryl or Maurice Merleau-Ponty, other like Buddhist thinkers like Vasubandhu, arguably the Buddha himself, right?
Yeah. I guess like I broadly agree with that. Like I think that it's completely unclear to me that like value can exist outside of states of consciousness that have like a model of value. And then another good post from Andres would be the tyranny of the intentional object on his blog, Qualia Computing, in which he kind of like he has this thought experiment involving Sandy, the golden retriever. And like, why does Sandy, like sand, or why does Sandy love running at the beach? And it's very easy to be confused by the semantic or the intentional content of our experiences. Like, say, Sandy the dog loves running on the beach, and whenever Sandy's at the beach, Sandy just gets a lot of pleasure, and Sandy thinks, oh well, it is the beach itself that is like the essence of pleasure or the essence of value. Rather than, oh, I'm inhabiting a world simulation that has parameters and it's currently calibrated in such a way that when I'm representing this concept, then like I get like a strong burst of enjoyment. I mean, likewise, when we eat food, like say we're at a cafe and I try like a cake or something like that, and I like it and you don't like it, like I think this is quite an obvious.
That's not in the cake itself.
Yeah, it has to do with like parameters of our nervous systems when we come into contact with sensory stimuli. But like, like the locus of value is within the experience. It's not within like the objects or the stimuli that we come into contact with that gives rise to the representation.
These hypothetical stimuli, which we are never directly acquainted with.
Yeah, basically.
Which you could take in an idealist, a metaphysically idealist direction, which,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes in these interviews, it's difficult to maintain the simulated perspective of a third-person observer who would not be as familiar with these topics as we both are, and try to bring them in as a imagined third party here and make context and relevance there. Is there anything unclear in there so far that we might want to clear up? I mean, maybe we can do a part 2 if any of this is really obscure. Okay. So maybe as a corollary to value, let's talk about valence. What is that?
Yes. So, I mean, valence is like the quality of consciousness or the quality of experience that, feels pleasant or aversive, or, I mean, you could use like whatever terms or labels to describe it: happiness or unhappiness or sadness.
Value, disvalue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, broad, like, I guess like minimally, it's like an axis with 2 antipodal points. But it's also not just like, kind of one dimensional. It's like, There's a really good diagram in Principia Qualia from Michael Johnson, where he posits like a triangle of like positive, negative, and neutral, and you can kind of like fall anywhere within those. You can have mixed valence experiences. Say like if I'm watching a movie with my friends and I have like an injury, maybe it's like slightly unpleasant, localized within the leg region of my body map, but like on the whole, it's positive.
Yep.
Yeah, but
I kind of want to jump in there and say something about meditative phenomenology, which that one of the oft-remarked benefits of kind of decoupling, unfixating from localized attention is that any local disvalue is kind of relativized and minimized within a much broader phenomenological field that is not, and there's something about tension as well, pinch points, which is released progressively.
Nice. Yeah. There's also something else that sometimes I talk about in the context of like valence and value, is that like the concept of like empathy gap is like really relevant here when we're talking about like why do certain valence experiences matter, or why do certain experiences like extreme suffering, why are they important to to find solutions or like treat.
I mean, some people will go off and say with some frequency like, so what? Why should I care?
So I would say that like it's actually there's a sense in which it's impossible to grasp like the importance of valence, and especially extreme valence experiences, given that it's like plausibly like exponential or like nonlinear in its distribution scales. Like if you've only ever experienced like say like a mild to moderate suffering, you kind of might think that the scales are linear. And likewise with pleasure. Like I think it's easier to experience just as like a naturally evolved animal. It's easier to experience extreme suffering because like the adaptive value of like having that signal represented within your experience, and then having the behavioral response of like getting away from something that's going to cause you extreme bodily harm, for example, like that has like a lot of adaptive value. I don't think the same is true with pleasure. But I think that like a lot of people, especially you
don't see great reproductive success among very attained meditators.
But a lot of people, especially like we're having this call from like thermally regulated and indoor environments, and I presume you have access to food and water wherever you are. I've been like snacking throughout the day. There's a hospital just down the road.
Happy mammal.
Yeah, like I'm fine. Like most people are generally fine until they're not, but that usually occurs like much later in life, and there is
lucky.
Like
and relatively well off.
But even if you're not well off, we have anesthetic. There's just this massive empathy gap between like how bad suffering really is, and as I said, like you can only really know from having had like an experience that allows you
of extreme pain or extreme mental anguish.
Yeah. I mean, maybe there's a threshold that you cross beyond which you can kind of like make an inference about, oh wow, like things get really bad past here, and so maybe you like update your priors about like the badness of suffering. But it's impossible to say.
I myself, and I know many people who have had extreme mental anguish or extreme physical pain, such that if they were put in that state again, or they can recall in that state, they would prefer death.
Yeah.
to remaining in that state for 1 second longer. So.
I can't say I've had like 1 second longer, but probably like a few weeks or something. I'd probably experience something similar.
And then you can make judgments about whether that is a rational statement. Given that state is temporary, but from within that state, it's like an undeniable like no. Death would be preferable to this agony.
Yeah. And for these reasons, I think it's like basically impossible to convince like any AI model that currently exists, or like any AGI that isn't sentient. I think it'd be impossible to convey like what actually matters, or like as I said, this is my conception of what most closely approximates intrinsic value. And unless you're a sentient being, you actually don't have access to the value function of the universe, if you will, on the assumption that consciousness is like a part of reality and a part of physics, and valence is also like a non-leaky kind of property of consciousness. Like it's not a leaky abstraction that can just be explained away with a better understanding. It's
yeah. No, I mean, if you want to pick out fundamental building blocks of the world model, if not, the extrapolated,
yeah.
whatever our final physical model of reality is, then valence is right there at the base.
Yeah, totally.
So what are your thoughts, having explored a lot of domains, academically and personally, with regard to phenomenology, and theory and all of this good stuff, on selfhood, on the problem of suffering writ large? What should we be doing here? We've talked a bunch about what possibly is. How about we move to ought? What are some imperatives, or, well, if not imperatives, directions, for us to take?
Yeah, so it strikes me that, like, I guess there are like two kind of questions in that, because you just referenced selfhood, and then like the problem of suffering at large. Like, I've actually never really been that concerned with personal identity, which is kind of strange because it does kind of
Given
like
your preoccupation with the problem of suffering, that's usually where people go sooner or later.
Yeah. I mean, I guess if you kind of, I had the kind of insight pretty early on about like the badness of suffering, and I was like, oh, doesn't matter who experiences it, and
Sure, most people don't. It takes a leap.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of thought, oh, this is maybe just like, maybe personal identity is just a kind of a facet of being a human, and it's part of our human model of the world. After all, humans are social animals, and I thought, well, if it seems like there is a thing that is self, while for, I don't know, like a polar bear, or like, I don't know, consider any kind of like asocial species, it doesn't seem like there's a thing that is self. Then probably ultimately there isn't a thing that is self, and so I never really considered the question that much.
I mean, you could also disambiguate that notion of self into bodily and spatial self-location, an egocentric frame of reference, and phenomenological centeredness, perspectival, etc. You could decompose it quite a bit more than just the social sense of identity.
Exactly. Well, I guess I was kind of pointing toward like there's early in life you just have like a naive kind of conception of self and other, and I guess I was never that interested with that question. But then actually what you just said about phenomenological selfhood, like what parts of experience feel like self, I guess like somewhat recently in the last 3 years, I've been like, I've had quite a few experiences that have really, I guess like changed that, or just like shown me that it's like, maybe it can be a bit sticky, but you can actually like expand it, or you can shift it, and you can do really interesting things. And as a phenomenologist, I'm like super curious about self now. I wrote a short blog post a few weeks ago called "The Trinity of Selfhood," which I guess
I'll link it below.
My current model of self. Yeah.
And so, right, selfhood, problem of suffering writ large. What do? Or maybe just the problem of suffering writ large, and if selfhood comes into that picture, you can say something about that.
So there's, I guess, like, as I mentioned before, for most of my life, I've been working in animal ethics and animal welfare because I was convinced this is just like obviously the highest leverage kind of cause to be pursuing relative to, like human suffering. Sure, it matters a whole bunch, but ultimately there are like fewer than 10 billion humans on the planet. And there are like, hundreds of trillions of non-humans, especially if you consider, non-humans in the wild, and also if you consider invertebrates. And so I thought, this is just like a massive multiplier on any sort of like action that I can take, is dealing with these neglected and more popular species. So I was kind of like, that was my strategy for quite a while, and tackling, the problem of suffering. But I'm
looking at in terms of advocacy and policy reform and research and that kind of thing.
Yeah, or just like, finding, like a lot of my early writings in philosophy were just like writing essays about neglected cause areas within, suffering reduction or animal advocacy. But it's kind of shifted to consciousness research primarily for the fact that I realized that what we're doing when we do any sort of like, kind of action in order to, help those who are suffering, is we are kind of working with a system that is adapted in a context where there is a mapping between sensory stimulus and phenomenal quality or phenomenal property. I prick my finger with a needle, and then there's some sort of like process that determines the mapping between that stimuli and then the quality of pain that I experience in that region of my body map. And it made me realize actually maybe much like inconceivably larger, higher leverage strategy would be to actually understand this mapping, understand what consciousness is, understand what valence is, and then build technologies.
The deep structure of valence and consciousness, how it arises in the beginning.
Yeah, and then build technologies that directly, interface with the thing itself, rather than the thing that happens to be correlated with what we actually want to causally affect under certain conditions. Because if you look at like an animal welfare science, there are like literally like hundreds of or thousands of models of animal welfare, and some of them are like useful in certain contexts given certain assumptions about this mapping relationship. But like we can't even validate these models because we don't have access to the experiences of other beings.
Sure, we don't have a principled theory of consciousness that would actually allow us to meaningfully measure any intervention.
Yeah, and they're super like context sensitive. Like maybe it only works for a given species, farmed maybe in these climate conditions or something like that. And it's like actually the perfect theory of well-being would apply equally for any given sentient being in any context. And and it would also tell you what to do in order to like build the technology, say a qualia scope or something like that. So this is why I'm working more on consciousness stuff at the moment, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. Yeah, I mean, getting at root causes, all for it, and root structures.
Another reason why I think it's like super important is that I think such a technology certainly like could exist, and maybe it's actually really simple and just not many people have worked on the problem for long enough. But if it was developed, it could actually just be like a weapon of mass destruction. So I think there is also like an existential risk type, kind of long-termist kind of argument to be made, which is to say we want team consciousness to find out how to, find the technology that directly modulates phenomenology. Because if it's like, a model of the world that is like been hijacked by a replicating process that's indifferent to well-being, then it's kind of like, the long-term future could be extinguished very quickly. So, yeah.
Yeah. In the conversation with Shinzen about the kind of long-term or even immediate ethics of developing ultrasonic neuromodulation technology, he made the same argument. Like the technology is here to real-time. I mean, and who knows whether ultrasound will be focused. Ultrasound will be the prize technology in 10, 15 years. We may develop other interventions, but right now we have technology at various scales that can pretty dramatically alter phenomenology. The tests they've been running are at kind of low intensity stimulation, but the research in other areas or people doing independent experimentation, including this is already here in a primitive form.
Yeah, in a primitive form, because it's kind of like it's technology that certainly like it's interesting because we haven't been developing technologies that interface with phenomenology yet, and so we're still kind of in the proto experimental phase of just being like throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, and ultrasound, like focused ultrasound, that seems to work. Still, like being researched quite heavily. It would be interesting if, like, say, in 10 years' time, where there's like enough experimental data and enough like updating of the technology in order to like perfectly say you want the taste of cheesecake in this region of your experiential field, you can like perfectly do that. Or say you just want to like eliminate suffering for all sentient beings within like a 50-kilometer radius, like this. I mean, that's crazy. If you consider like certain theories of consciousness, like electromagnetic field theories of consciousness, this is like in principle possible if you just have like the right signal transmitted in such a way that like it directly modulates the topology of the field. Again, assuming a bunch of philosophical assumptions, but like it is kind of inconceivable like what might be possible if we kind of cracked the problem. Experimenting will be like a part of it, but also I think like there's a role for theory, and if we can like do what like Mike Johnson kind of outlines in Principia Qualia, if we can like get the right formalism, then I think it's kind of like a race for team consciousness.
Well, I'm putting all my chips on team consciousness.
Me too. Yeah.
Well, Asher, I've run out of topics here. What would you like to talk about?
Yeah, so I guess we've talked a lot about consciousness and sentience. I could talk a bit about my work, but like I guess the topic of my thesis, and kind of what I've done the most of, at least in the academic sphere, regarding like suffering in nature, if that's relevant.
Yeah. So how maybe this might be a bit grim, but how bad is it out there?
So yeah, I will say like super uncertain. And so like the broad topic of my thesis is actually how do we aggregate well-being at the macro level, or how do we like make estimations about aggregate well-being within like populations or ecosystems or even entire planets. And yeah, in order to do that, like assuming like hedonic theory of well-being, like I guess like to do it perfectly, we would need like the like a formalism of consciousness, or we'd need like a qualia we'd need the technology that we just described.
Sure.
But there are like I guess theoretical models that have been developed by philosophers, trying to I guess like come to an approximation of how bad it might be out there. And for maybe like several years, I kind of as I mentioned, like my career has been a series of like adjustments or like refocusing the aperture of my course prioritization. For quite a while I was focusing on the problem of wild animal suffering, which is essentially, as I said before, there are like countless numbers of animals in the wild, and like wild animal suffering seems to be a problem because the most optimal evolutionary strategies or life history strategies more broadly, which describes patterns of survival and reproduction for different organisms, the most optimal ones in a wide variety of conditions seem to be having like thousands of offspring, or in some cases
Sure.
like millions over the course of a lifetime.
A very small percentage of which actually survive, and fewer of those reach maturity.
Yeah. Like statistically, you only need like one offspring per reproducing parent in order to survive to the point of reproducing themselves.
So why not make thousands or hundreds of thousands, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like evolutionary processes, they optimize for fitness. And in some cases, like I think this is another thing to be aware of as a human, like we're extremely lucky because we happen to be like an extremely rare case of like a lot of the traits that happen to be, like selected for over the course of our evolution are actually highly correlated with well-being. So like we have maternal care, we have like community and friendships and people who selflessness,
mutual aid. Altruism is arguably selected for within the populations for social primates.
And then also just like basic things like I get to live theoretically until like I'm 80 or something like that. Maybe we hit long escape velocity before then, but for a lot of animals, I mean, like we were talking about cephalopods before, but like think about octopuses. Within I think octopuses generally live like, depending on the species, like a year or two, and then the octopus mother brooding over her eggs. As soon as the eggs begin to hatch, her limbs literally start to fall off, and that's because the selection pressure that would like essentially kind of select for or the evolutionary process that would select for traits that allow for her to continue surviving has no reason to basically allow her.
Why maintain the organism beyond that? I mean, you see the same thing with salmon. I remember very, very vividly, there's salmon runs in a provincial park where I grew up. And I remember going in to this park that I'd visited before and just seeing the river just flush full of dead and rotting salmon.
Yeah.
I was like, oh my God, it's a fucking massacre.
Yeah, and I mean these kinds of events are like super common, in nature. But we also don't see them because obviously we're not out in nature at the moment. Like humans have literally spent like the last few thousands of years like build as optimized as possible building structures to keep nature
progressively insulating ourselves from the horrors of
And so I mean, it's also like, this isn't to say, I don't want to say nature is like rife with suffering or that suffering predominates happiness in nature. This could well be the case. And it's like important that, we don't let what's convenient to believe like get in the way of what is actually the case. Like I think
but the jury's out. I mean, the traditional Buddhist view, for example, is it's just one view, is that no, suffering by far predominates everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. but at the
in
same,
the human as well as animal realms.
yeah,
I mean, life for humans, for most humans, arguably has gotten much better due to technology and innovation. But
yeah, yeah. But at the same time, I want to say that like until we like understand what consciousness is, or we can like at the very least build technology that like makes changes that are like sufficiently precise that we can like predictably raise, say, the hedonic set point of different organisms. This is something like David Pearce has written quite a lot about.
right.
And actually just like engineer or optimize for well-being. It's super unclear, and I just think more research has to be done in this area, which is why I decided to do a PhD thesis based on it, if that makes sense.
Totally makes sense. I'm glad you're doing the work, and
Yeah.
some of our friends and colleagues are as well.
Yeah.
Well, I have exhausted my topics. We might just want to keep this short and sweet.
Yeah. And as you said, we could do a follow up if you have any more
Yeah.
questions.
If people have questions, if anyone wants us to discourse around anything here, let us know. Where can people find you? Your writing, your work?
Yeah, so I have a few different websites. Like my academic one, which has like a really outdated photo of me, is ashersoryl.com. So yeah, I guess you'll have my name in the descriptions. You just like Soryl.
I'll put the links in.
And then I also have like more of like a personal thing, like a blog with just a bunch of lists of things that I like and fun posts called arataki.me. That's like my middle name, and sometimes I go by Asher Arataki online. And yeah, that's about it for now. But I do have a project that's like underway that is somewhat secretive. So maybe in the future I'll share more information about that. But...
Super secret, tantalizing project. Okay, well, we'll be on the lookout for that. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks Asher for coming on, and take care everybody. Bye.